Greetings YouTubers and welcome to the Gear Bench. Today we're here to talk about performance nutrition specifically for the activities of hiking and backpacking. Now, as a skeptic, I have to tell you the topic of nutrition is a bit of a minefield. Most of what's out there falls more in the category of lifestyle advice than it does actual science. I did a lot of research for this project, and what I discovered was that virtually all the published, peer-reviewed scientific studies relate to either weight loss or sports and athletic performance. Well, backpackers are neither here nor there, so what I had to do for this project was assemble the relevant information from a variety of studies not actually meant for hiking. Because of that, I'll show my work as I go, and so you can see and check all the references and ultimately decide for yourself. So stick with me as I try to figure out what foods might make the best fuel for your outdoor adventures. To start with, glucose, aka blood sugar, isn't what powers your muscles. Adenosine triphosphate, ATP, is the actual molecule that provides the energy for muscle contraction. By way of analogy, an ATP molecule is like a rechargeable battery. It gets discharged contracting a muscle, and then along comes glucose from eating carbs as the power bank that recharges that battery. But it isn't just glucose. Free fatty acids from dietary fat are another way to recharge your ATP, depending on the circumstances. The fact that carbs can prolong your endurance is arguably obvious, but can we do better than just eating these sugary gels? In a study on the effect of a carbohydrate protein supplement on endurance performance, researchers had cyclists work out for 3 hours to use up their reserves and then sprint to exhaustion on 3 different supplements, which were administered every 20 minutes throughout the test. There was placebo, carbohydrates, and then a carb-protein combination. Now, carbs obviously helped the test subjects last longer, but the big news is how a relatively modest addition of protein in the ratio of 1 part protein for every 4 parts carbohydrates resulted in a 37% increase in endurance over carbs alone. That's huge. Basically, the presence of protein wakes up the enzyme processes that aid in the transfer of nutrients into muscle cells, which in turn benefits not just amino acid uptake, but glucose as well. It essentially opens the cellular throttle and lets fuel in quicker, which helps keep you going longer. So even a little protein can have a profound effect on endurance. Now, proteins are made up of amino acids, including the 9 essential amino acids, and they do more than just boost your carbs' endurance-enhancing benefits. Researchers put untrained men through a 12-week resistance training program using the following supplements: placebo, carbohydrate, essential amino acids, and both carbs and aminos. They then measured each group's muscle fiber area and concluded that carbs plus aminos enhance muscle growth to a greater extent than either carbs or aminos consumed independently. They also measured each group's excretion of 3-methylhistidine, which is a biomarker for muscle protein breakdown. They noted that exercising with just a placebo caused a 52% increase in this damaging byproduct, but their carb-amino cocktail resulted in a 26% decrease. And they concluded that the synergistic effect of carb plus amino ingestion maximizes muscle growth by reducing the protein degradation that occurs after exercise. Again, essential amino acids come from eating protein. And that can be a tremendous benefit to somebody who's going to punish their body nearly every single day for the next 5 months of a thru hike. In review, carbs are important fuel to prolong endurance, but they work best when taken with protein in a 4-to-1 ratio. This not only multiplies the performance-enhancing benefits of those carbs, but it also prevents the muscle breakdown that comes from working out. Now, there are 2 main sources of energy during muscular exercise, and carbs are only one of them. The other is fats. There's more than twice as much energy stored in a gram of fat than there is in a gram of carbohydrate. So from a calorie density perspective, fats weigh less than half as much as carbs do when carried in your pack. Next, we look at something called the thermic effect of food. In order to make use of the energy in the fuel we eat, those nutrients have to be digested. and that process uses up some energy of its own. As it turns out, fats digest more efficiently than carbs. In fact, carbs waste from 3 to 4 times as much energy in lost heat. So, for every 1,000 calories of fat in your food bag, you'll get 970 for actual work, but only 920 from the carbs, 50 calories less. Now figure if you pack 4,000 calories per day times 5 days between resupplies, and that difference becomes 1,000 calories. It's literally like carrying all of this food that you don't eat, you just throw away. It's just one more advantage that favors fats over carbs for the weight-conscious hiker that's trying to make the most of the calories they'll be hauling up and down mountains. So fats are ideal carry calories, but how are they as fuel? As is often the case, the answer is it depends. And what it depends on is the intensity of the exercise. Researchers studied subjects exercising at 3 different intensity levels. 25% VO2 max, which is comparable to a walking pace. 65% VO2 max, which is the greatest running pace sustainable for 2 to 4 hours, so like a marathon. And 85% VO2 max, which is the greatest pace sustainable for 30 to 60 minutes, more like a 10,000 meter dash. They then took biopsies and blood samples to determine what fraction of the energy expended at each exertion level came from glycogen, which is the stored form of glucose in the muscles, versus fat. And what they discovered was rather interesting. Their data produced the following chart. It shows the energy contributions from both muscles and plasma for both glycogen and triglycerides, and they're not in order. So I redrew it to give it a more straightforward presentation of carbs versus fats. So this is what your body is using for fuel when you exercise. And you can see that it's not so simple as to just say this many carbs or that much fat. It depends on the intensity level of that exercise. And the differences are dramatic. At a walking pace, over 90% of the energy you use comes from fat stores. Only 10% is from sugar. But as you start to run, now it's almost half sugar that you're burning. And should you burst into an Olympic dash, those carbs you stored are paying for more than 2/3 of that effort. Interesting stuff. But remember how I said virtually all of the bona fide scientific studies focus on athletes and sports? Well, this study is a case in point. Notice how they tested exertion levels of 25, 65, and 85, but skipped right over 45%. That's inconvenient for us because somewhere between walking and running is right about where hiking hills with a pack ought to be. Well, I couldn't find any studies that did the same research for hikers. I couldn't even find a qualified reference for what the VO2 max of hiking might be. So I had to swag it. I found reference to a study that put 2 groups of men, trained and untrained, through 4 hours on a treadmill at what was described as a brisk pace. For the untrained men, this elicited exertion at 43% VO2 max, right at the level of our missing column. Of course, this was on flat ground without a backpack. Now, a lot of thru hikers do seem to walk at a brisk pace, but they can't be considered untrained. So when the trained group walked at the same speed, they were only exerting themselves at 28% VO2 max. So a pace that's halfway toward running for an untrained individual feels more like a casual walk to somebody who's in good shape. Now take that fit walker who's only at 28% effort, unladen on flat ground, and slap a pack on their back and send them up a mountain. You might end up back somewhere around the 45% VO2 max mark. And it's admittedly somewhat of an assumption, but it's the best one that I've got. Let's go back to the energy use chart. For our purposes, we don't care about an Olympic dash, so ditch the column for 85%. Then move the 65 over to make room for a 45% column in the middle. This is where our estimate for backpacking lies. And I simultaneously redrew the column heights so they are expressed no longer in total energy expended, but as the percentage of total calories burned from either carbs or fats. Then I just interpolated values that were halfway between the numbers for 25 and 65. And I should note that a potential problem with that assumption is that the relationship might not be linear. Also, we're assuming that backpacking for experienced hikers is about 45% exertion. And that will depend on your fitness level, the type of terrain you're hiking, how fast you walk, and the weight of your pack. Now, even if you can't call it a precise analysis, we ought to at least be somewhere in the ballpark. After all of that, this is the picture you end up with. As you quest for Canada along the Pacific Crest Trail, about 70% of your energy comes from fat calories. And if that's at all surprising, it may be because you've been systematically indoctrinated to the importance of carbohydrates, because a vast majority of the articles out there on fueling your workout are focused on higher intensity activities. The revelation here is advice for runners isn't particularly applicable to backpackers. All right, so remember that the point of all this was to figure out what foods make good fuel for hiking. While only scientific references are allowed to make the point, popular articles can be good for getting that power quote that sums up everything nicely. In an article that specifically connects the dots between all these scientific studies on metabolism and some real-world advice on what you should actually eat to best fuel performance, exercise physiologist Elizabeth Quinn sums it up like this: fat is great fuel for endurance events. And in an article on fat and carbohydrate utilization during exercise, PhD Brad Dieter summarizes, both fat and carbohydrates are used to fuel exercise, but how you train is going to dictate which one makes a greater contribution. At high intensities, more carbohydrates are used. At lower intensities, more fat is used. Fuel accordingly, and your nutrition is already most of the way there. In other words, if you're burning fat, eat fat. By way of analogy, think of yourself like a hybrid engine that can use two different kinds of fuel, and the fuel you need depends on what you'll be doing. Racing requires high-octane gasoline. Load hauling on challenging terrain is best done with diesel. For trail running, carbs are the fuel of speed, but for backpacking, it's fat that gives the most miles per gallon. Inevitably, this kind of talk triggers the people with PTSD from the war on fat. Elizabeth Quinn addresses some of these concerns in her medically reviewed article on converting fat to energy during exercise. Dietary fat has been blamed for many health problems, but it is actually an essential nutrient for optimal health. Fat provides insulation to internal organs, it protects the nerves, and it's necessary for transporting all of your fat-soluble vitamins throughout the body via your bloodstream. She also points out, stored body fat is different from dietary fat. Fat only gets stored in the body if you eat more calories than you use, and that's from any foods, including carbs. And this is when I point out that hiking is essentially a nomadic experiment in calorie deprivation. This article from REI points out that the average thru hiker on the Appalachian Trail takes 165 days to finish and loses about 30 pounds while doing it. That's a total deficit of over 100,000 calories for the entire trip, which works out to a daily deficit of over 600 calories. Now, for weight considerations alone, many hikers choose to carry even less food than they need on the trail, requiring them to make up those losses by eating like crazy people once they get to town. In short, none of the fat calories you eat on the trail are going to end up on your ass. You'll burn absolutely every single gram you have and end up dipping substantially into those bodily reserves. All of this adds up to the reason why you want your calories as dense and as efficient as possible, so you can carry as little as possible, yet still have the energy to complete your hike. And it just so happens that the lightest food to carry is also the most efficient fuel for backpacking. And that fuel is fat. So carbs and protein in the right ratio can enhance your endurance and protect your muscles. But now we know that fats are actually the majority player in your energy budget. I looked around for some second opinions on that to help develop a recommendation. I found this graph on carbohydrate utilization during training at bodybuilding.com. Unfortunately, it's not referenced, but it does show a continuum of exercise intensity, so we can go right to 45% for our estimate of backpacking. The graph shows 38% carb use at that level, which leaves about 62% for fat. That's in decent agreement with the previous chart showing about a 30-70 split. I did find one other actual medical study on the crossover concept, which is the intensity level at which carbs overtake fats as the predominant fuel. And cleaning that graph up and taking a measurement at 45% aerobic power yields 43% fat use versus 57% for carbs. Somewhat different than the other two, but they don't specify the fitness level of the people used to model the data in their graph. And we've already seen how fitness level can substantially change where a given amount of exertion lands you on the effort percentage. Fair enough, it gives us a range to work with when developing a diet recommendation. Now, I've broken the eating done while hiking into 4 different events. There's breakfast, trail snacks, a recovery snack, and dinner. And in this video, we'll just cover breakfast and trail snacks. Recovery and dinner will be in part 2. Starting with breakfast, the first tip is, don't skip it. I know folks that don't like to bother in the morning. They just want to break camp, get going, and maybe have a granola bar on the trail. Well, researchers exercised cyclists to exhaustion and measured how long it took under 4 different feeding regimens. There was placebo, pre-exercise carbohydrates, carbs during the exercise, and then carbs both before and during. Now, obviously, hikers have to eat throughout the day, so unless you've run out of food, you will fall under the fuels during exercise category. But look at the difference between during and both before and during. If that holds true for long-distance hiking, then skipping breakfast to just eat on the trail causes a 12% loss of endurance. That costs you almost 2 miles by the end of a 20-mile day. Don't skip breakfast. Okay, good. But what should that breakfast be composed of? Since you're backpacking, you'd like the food you carry to be as light as practicable, so the first thing you might consider is the number of calories per ounce. From my previous videos, which discuss calorie density in detail, I have the following rating system. For a discussion of how I arrived at these values, see the video linked in the description below. Next, the evidence suggests that the majority of your calories should come from fat. Using the graphs shown previously, I came up with a range of fat content by percent of total calories, reflected in the following key. Now, the value judgments in the rating column, i.e. the good, very good, etc., are my own. They're what I call science-based subjectivity. As with all my rating systems, feel free to make your own judgments. The color bands will still serve to help rank the data visually, and of course the raw numbers are right there for you to see. The rest of your calories, the ones that aren't fat, should be made up of carbohydrates and proteins in the optimum ratio. Again, I developed a key to help you visually scan the data so you can more easily locate foods with the numbers that you prefer. Finally, there's one last thing to consider that relates to the performance aspects of those carbohydrates: the glycemic index, which is basically a measure of how hard and fast the sugar hits your system from the carbs you eat, and therefore also how quickly it fades. Now, glycemic index can be affected by the amount of other nutrients in the food, the presence of acids like vinegar, and whether or not the food is cooked. But it depends primarily on the quantity and type of carbohydrates, sugars versus complex carbs. And those are what's available on food labels, so they serve as my proxies for glycemic index. From a study by Wolliver and team comes this graph on the blood glucose response from high and low GI foods. You can see how high glycemic foods give you a fast, large spike in blood glucose, the sugar rush. But it doesn't last. After about an hour, that boost is all but gone already. And what's worse, look at what happens at around an hour and a half, 2 hours after you've eaten. Your blood glucose rebounds. It drops so low that it actually dips below baseline, lower even than before you ate. That sharp increase in glucose provokes such a strong insulin response, your system ends up overcompensating. This is the infamous insulin crash that follows the sugar rush. Not exactly something you want to try and hike through. Fortunately, there are complex carbs. No sudden boost of energy, but no crash either. It's a slower onset, but a longer ride. Whereas your sugar high is already peaking after only about 30 minutes, those oats in your oatmeal are still building after an hour. And they keep your glucose in the positive all the way out to 3 hours with no crash at all. This all works together well for a couple of reasons. Rarely do the things you eat contain only one type of carbohydrates. They're almost always a mix of both simple and complex. That means you can make use of the advantages of both types. Have at least some sugar in your snack to give you that quick response when hungry, but have a good portion of complex carbs to float you over any sugar valleys and take you out to that 3-hour mark. The 3 hours is significant because that's about how long it takes all those fats to digest and start entering your system. So just as the complex carbs are fading away, the fats start kicking in. Basically, a well-proportioned snack is like a metabolic relay race. Sugar bursts off the blocks with that right now boost. But after about an hour, sugar is handing off the baton to complex carbs, which will run for the next 2 hours before finally handing off to fats for the final leg of the relay. I could not find an authoritative source of what percent of your carbs should be sugar versus complex, and it will vary depending on the intensity and duration of your exercise. So I sort of reverse engineered the data we've got so far to produce the following scale. If, as we've established, about 2/3 of your calories should be from fat, let's say 65%, that means 35% for everything else, and that everything else should be a 4-to-1 ratio of carbs to protein. That means 1 part in 5 is protein for 7% of total calories, leaving 28% for all of our carbs. If those carbs are evenly split between simple and complex, we'll get 14% of our calories from each type. So, based on everything I've researched, the meal that's scientifically engineered to provide you the longest, most efficient fuel for endurance endeavors is about 65% fat, 14% complex carbs, 14% sugar, and 7% protein by calories. And I'll stand by that, but also have to admit some, call it judgment or call it preference in the exact percentage of sugar shown in the key. It depends on your style. Do you prefer to eat a meal replacement bar once every few hours? Or do you like nibbling from a sack of trail mix every half hour all day long? For the occasional eater, opt for the lower sugar content, whereas a constant consumer might be okay with smaller portions of sweeter stuff. As always, the colors are just a guide. Now, between breakfast and trail snacks, the nutritional profile is essentially the same. That is, same ratios and percentages of macronutrients, with maybe 2 small differences. For breakfast, you've been fasting all night. Your reserves need a jump start, and you may not be planning on sitting around camp all morning before hitting the trail. So, maybe consider a marginally higher sugar content to start the day. Think light blue on the sugar key. Your first trail snack, however, likely won't come until breakfast is digesting its way through the fat leg of the relay. To avoid the ups and downs of sugar shocking your system all day long, consider using the dark blue part of the key for all of your midday munchies as you hike. And the other difference relates to portion size. You might want breakfast to be a larger number of calories. You are trying to top off your reserves after fasting for hours, and it'd be nice to get a good lunch down the trail before you have to start digging in your pack for snacks. For trail snacks, portion size depends on how often you like to eat during the day. I personally don't take a proper lunch on the trail. That is to say, I don't wait until midday to have a larger 600 to 800 calorie meal and then wait hours again for dinner. Instead, I have a series of 200 calorie snacks every hour or 2 until I'm done hiking for the day. Then it's time for a recovery snack before dinner, but those 2 meals will be addressed in part 2 of this series. So, we have a fine theory at this point, but it's just theory. How do we translate this nutritional construct into actual food? Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you the chart. If you watch my videos on calorie density, you'll be familiar with the chart. If not, well, it's a massive list of over 900 food items in 20 different categories where everything has been rated and sorted by calories per ounce. What's new is I've expanded the carbs columns into individual categories of fiber, sugar, and other, which is the leftover category for complex carbs. I also added 3 new columns for each of the nutritional performance ratings we've been discussing in this video. So now you'll see color-coded numbers for the carb-protein ratio, the percentage of total calories derived from fat, and the percent calories from sugar. The chart itself still groups the foods by category and then sorts them by calorie density from highest to lowest. So it makes it easy, for example, to scan nutrition bars for the lightest weight options that also have near optimum nutritional performance across all 3 criteria. One of the reoccurring themes in my calorie density dissertations was that both brand and flavor matter. For example, I charted over 240 different nutrition bars, and look how many kind bars made the top 30 by density for their 142 calories per ounce. And with our new ratings columns, you can see that in addition to being color-coded as very light, several flavors also have near-perfect carb-protein ratios, as well as being in the optimum range for both fat and sugar content. Now contrast that to your average Cliff bar. By density, they almost all rate as heavy, and while some of the carb-pro ratios are okay, they run high in sugar and short on fat. I should reiterate, however, that ideal sugar and fat percentages are based on the intensity of your exercise. Cliff bars are marketed for climbing, which is more strenuous than hiking. For that purpose, the higher sugar content may be appropriate. But for hikers, those just aren't the best numbers. But Cliff has not forsaken you. They have this line of nut butter-filled bars that are not only rather tasty, but also better suited to the exercise intensity that backpacking generally involves. These bars bring a lightweight rating with ideal carb-pro ratios and near optimum fat and sugar levels. One more quick example of how these new data columns help shed some light on the nutritional content and some of these foods that you may have been eating without thinking about it in quite such a clinical way. Lara Bar makes a point of noting their bars are unsweetened, but they average a sugar content of 38%. For perspective, now look at the sugar levels of the top candies in the chart. This cherry pie bar is 43% sugar. That's over 150% more sugar than the average candy bar shown here at 28%. And it's about 3 times the sugar content of the average dark chocolate bar. That was sort of an eye-opener for me, and it's why you might find browsing the chart somewhat interesting. Anyway, I encourage you to download the chart. It's totally free, and I went to a lot of trouble to include as many hiker favorite foods as I could. See how not just ramen noodles rate, but everything from Nor rice and pasta sides to tortillas, fruit, nut butters, nuts and seeds, even energy gels. Did you know how many varieties of trail mix there is? How about cookies? Or cereal? The Backpacker's Pantry granola has basically everything we talked about for an optimum camp breakfast. It's lightweight, it has a near ideal CP ratio, a good amount of fat to keep you going for a while, but with a slightly higher light blue percentage of sugar, good for that initial launch down the trail. And the 2-serving pouch has got a substantial 1,240 calories, so you can hike for hours before needing that first snack. Bonus, it's granola with the powdered milk already added. Just pour water and eat right out of the bag. No cooking, no preps, no dishes. It's perfect for me. Use the chart to find your perfect foods. With over 900 foods to choose from, you should be able to find something you enjoy eating that still meets your desired nutritional criteria. But not everything will. To that I say, first and foremost, food is to be enjoyed. Despite my apparent obsession with eating by the numbers, I'm the first to admit that. But eating the stuff you like doesn't necessarily mean you have to abandon its potential as performance fuel. It just takes a little pre-planning and a touch of creativity. I like these ginger snap waffles from Honey Stinger. They rate very light by density, they're extremely compact, and they're delicious. But they're basically all carbs with a lot of sugar and not a trace of protein. Well, I also love peanut butter. However, it's almost all fat and protein with very few carbs and almost no sugar at all. In each case, the food tastes great. They each have desired components of good hiking nutrition, but individually their ratios are way off and the percentages are either too high or too low. Just eat them in the same meal. Mashed up together in your stomach, your body doesn't know they were separate servings. And in combination, they become an ultralight option with an almost perfect carb-protein ratio and near optimum percentages of both fat and sugar. Just one more example to illustrate the range of options that combinations open up. I can't get enough of these Nature Valley coconut butter biscuits, but they're way too carb heavy. Well, I also like me some Old Trapper beef sticks, but they're just the opposite. All I have to do is eat one for the entree and the other for dessert. Voila! A 2-course lightweight snack that satisfies all my sweet salty cravings while providing me with a well-optimized fuel for the hike ahead. Now obviously I can't tell you what your favorites are, but the possibilities are endless. Well, that's it for part 1, folks. Hopefully by now you have an idea about how to approach menu planning, not just from an ultralight point of view, but from a nutritionist point of view, whether it's with individual items or items in combination. As always, I very much appreciate your time, and stay tuned for part 2, where we'll discuss the all-important recovery snack after a long day of hiking, and what to have for dinner that might best get you through until next morning. Thanks for watching.